She was thrown into a mine pit. The silent rancher went down after her. October 18th, 1879. Montana, midnight. The wind bit deep over the scarred ridges of Black Hollow, where fire once licked the bones of miners and turned steel to ash. The abandoned open-pit mine yawned like a grave in the earth, still pulsing with phantom heat. Ash drifted in the air like dead snow, and the moon above cast a pale, indifferent eye over the wasteland. Cass Hartley's boots scraped against gravel as she was dragged forward, her arms bound tight behind her with coarse rope. Blood trickled from her temple, where one of them had struck her earlier. Her lips were split, her coat torn, but her eyes, sharp and defiant, never looked down. The two men flanking her wore soot-streaked miners' clothes, kerchiefs pulled up to hide their faces. Their grips were rough, efficient. They did not speak at first. Only when they reached the lip of the smoldering crater did one of them finally chuckle. "She was digging too deep," he muttered. The other spat into the dirt. Her and that printing press. Could have just stuck to gossip and church flyers, but no, she had to poke at old embers. Cass narrowed her eyes, chest rising and falling with effort. "6 men died," she hissed. "You left them in there, locked the shaft door, called it an accident. You want justice," the taller one said, tightening his grip. "Here's how the earth handles justice." He nodded toward the pit. The smoke rising from it shimmered red with reflected heat. Though weeks had passed since the mine caught fire, the deep coal seams still smoldered. At the bottom, jagged rock glowed faintly like dying coals in a hearth. "Fire ate men once," he said coldly. "Now it'll eat you." Cass opened her mouth to scream, not for help, but to curse them, to speak the names of the dead, but the shove came before the words. Her body pitched forward. The world turned sideways. Her scream was lost in the roar of wind and heat. She clipped a jagged outcrop halfway down, her shoulder tearing open. Then she vanished into the pit. Silence returned. On a rise a few hundred yards away, the horses stirred. Weston Hale sat atop his black mare, staring through a battered brass spyglass. He had tracked them from gray smoke without a word, moving through shadows as if born from them. His coat flapped in the cold wind, brim of his hat low over his eyes. He said nothing. He never did. The spyglass followed the figures at the edge of the pit. He saw the shove, saw the fall, saw the men mount their horses and ride off, with not a glance back. Weston lowered the glass slowly. His face didn't change. Then he turned the mare with one hand and guided her down the slope. At the saddle, he untied a length of old leather strap, looped it around his waist, and cinched it with one hand. The other end he fastened to the saddle horn. He checked the knot twice. Then he dismounted, walked to the edge of the pit. Smoke curled from below, heat rising to meet the frost in the air. It was a long way down, sharp, still burning in places. The pit hissed like it was alive. Weston did not hesitate. He pulled his gloves tight, stepped backward to the edge, and threw himself down into the dark. One man, one rope, one impossible fall. No one saw him go. But the fire did. The world was ash and heat. Cass Hartley lay broken at the bottom of the mine pit, her body crumpled across the slanted rock, one leg bent unnaturally beneath her. Blood seeped from her calf, trailing down over soot-black stone, pooling against embers that still glowed faintly. Smoke curled upward in slow tendrils, dancing in the dim red light that pulsed from the earth like the last breath of a dying beast. Weston Hale knelt beside her without a word. His boots sizzled against the ground, the heat biting through the worn leather soles. He didn't speak. He never did. Instead, he untied the leather flask from his belt, poured what little water he had into his palm, and pressed it gently to Cass's cheeks, her brow, the hollow of her throat. Her lips parted, dry and cracked. A faint sound escaped, a breath, no more. Still nothing from Weston. He removed his belt in one fluid motion, then slid his knife free. With quick, deliberate cuts, he trimmed 2 narrow pieces from a collapsed timber nearby, blackened but sturdy. He wrapped them against her shin using the belt, crafting a splint with hands that had once roped wild mustangs and now steadied bones. Cass stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the thick air. She tried to sit, but pain shot through her leg, and a gasp escaped her lips. "Where?" she choked. Weston pressed a finger to her lips, then shook his head slowly. His eyes, steady and cool, locked on hers with a calm urgency. He reached beside them, tore off a slab of charred wood, and dragged the burnt edge across it with a chunk of coal. "They don't know I'm here." Cass read the message, her chest heaving with the effort of understanding. Then she nodded once. Together, they crawled slowly along the edge of the pit, avoiding the glowing fissures, the shifting gravel. The slope rose in places but crumbled in others. Every time Cass tried to stand, her leg buckled beneath her. Weston offered no arm to lean on. Instead, he crouched low and let her rest her weight against his back. He carried her like that for several yards, then lowered her gently behind a large slab of slag. The incline was steep now, the walls tightening toward a narrow path where broken timbers formed a makeshift climb. Cass tried to move first, gritting her teeth, using both hands to pull herself up, dragging her bad leg behind. Her palms bled against the jagged stone. Weston followed behind, never once asking if she could continue. He knew she would, or die trying. A sudden sound, the groan of shifting earth. The slope trembled. A shelf of loose shale broke loose above them, tumbling downward with a hiss and a crack like splitting bone. "Cass!" Weston lunged forward, shoving her sideways through a narrow crevice in the rocks. The slide came fast, red dust, glowing embers, and shards of burning timber. Weston turned his back to the fall. He didn't cry out, didn't even grunt. The rock slammed into him, sparks flying, wood scraping across his shoulders, tearing through fabric, through skin. The scent of burning leather filled the air. Cass screamed his name, once, sharp and raw. When the dust settled, he was still there, face down, smoke rising from his coat. She scrambled to him, hands trembling, turning him over. His eyes were open, jaw clenched. He looked at her like nothing had happened at all. Then, in a breathless rasp, he whispered, "Keep going." She stared at the wounds on his back, red and blistered, oozing beneath the torn shirt. Her own pain vanished in the shadow of his. She nodded again, fighting back tears. With Weston leaning against her now, they moved slowly through the last stretch of the pit, the red glow behind them fading. They hadn't escaped yet, but the silence of death was broken, and life, stubborn, searing, unspoken, had chosen to stay. The old shack creaked in the wind, its warped boards whispering with every gust, like the ghosts of men who once took shelter here. Cass dragged Weston inside, the door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Moonlight filtered through a hole in the roof, casting pale light on cracked floors and a leaning beam in the center of the room. She lowered him onto a bed of old canvas sacks. His breath came shallow, lips pressed tight. Blood had soaked the back of his shirt where the rocks had torn into his flesh. His skin was blistered, angry red. He didn't flinch. He hadn't made a sound since the rockfall. Cass ripped a strip of cloth from her petticoat, with shaking hands. Her fingers were slick with his blood as she pressed the makeshift bandage to his shoulder. He sucked in air but didn't pull away. "You should have died," she whispered. Weston didn't answer. She cleaned the wound the best she could, pouring what remained of their water over the burns. He winced, muscles twitching, but stayed still. "Why?" she finally asked, voice brittle. "Why did you jump in after me? You don't even know me." He sat up slowly, meeting her eyes in the flickering firelight. Then, wordless as ever, he stood and walked to the central beam of the shack. With one hand, he drew his knife from his belt. The blade caught the moonlight. He leaned close to the wood and began to carve, slow and deliberate. Cass approached, squinting at the jagged letters as they formed. "I know what it feels like to be left to die." The silence that followed was louder than any cry. She looked at him differently. The shadows softened on his face. Not a stranger, not just the cold rancher on the hill, a man who'd crawled out of fire before, and had never really left it. He sat again, back against the wall, and she sat across from him. "I found something," she said after a long pause. "In the mayor's office." His eyes flicked toward her. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat, pulling out a folded sheet of yellowed paper, the ink smudged but legible. Ledger from the mine. Payments made to fake names. Shutdown costs recorded weeks before the explosion. They knew it was coming. He took it from her carefully, studying the names. "I was going to print it," she said. "My father warned me not to. Said there were men who wouldn't let that kind of truth out. The night before I was taken, someone broke into the shop, ransacked it. My father was gone by morning." "You think they took him?" Weston asked, voice rough, rarely used. She looked down. "I don't know. I just know I had to run." He handed the paper back. Outside, a twig snapped. Cass's body went rigid. Weston's eyes narrowed. Another snap. Then hoofbeats. Faint, but closing in. He moved fast, silently, and pulled her toward the back wall, lifting a warped floorboard beneath an old bench. A narrow crawl space revealed itself, a forgotten root cellar, dark and shallow. "In," he said. She didn't argue. He followed her down just as a shadow crossed the window, a figure dismounting. The sound of boots on the porch. A pause. Cass lay flat on the cold earth, Weston beside her, his hand gently covering her mouth. Above them, the floor groaned under weight, a heavy step. Cass could see the beam of a lantern through a crack in the floorboard. Ash fell from the soles of the man's boots as he moved. Then, silence. They waited. Seconds stretched. Finally, the boots moved again, toward the door. A hinge squealed. Then the sound of a horse shifting. And then, nothing. Cass breathed out. Weston slowly removed his hand. They lay there in the dirt, faces inches apart, breaths mingling. "You saved me again," she whispered. Weston said nothing, but in the dark, he reached out and touched her hand just once. That was all. In gray smoke, the news spread like prairie fire. Local journalist perishes in mine accident. Read the headline sprawled across the front page of the Gray Smoke Gazette. Beneath it, a somber column painted a tidy picture of tragedy. Cass Hartley had fallen into the abandoned Black Hollow pit during an unauthorized investigation. No remains were recovered. No foul play suspected. Just an unfortunate accident. Regrettable, yes, but neatly concluded. By midday, the townspeople had already folded the truth into something they could live with. The mine had always been a cursed place, they muttered over coffee and prayer. Ought to have been sealed up years ago. Some offered pity, lowering their voices in respect for the dead. Others clucked their tongues and muttered that maybe Cass Hartley should have kept her nose out of men's business. But one man did not believe it. Noah Calder, the town's blacksmith, stood under the awning of his forge, the paper gripped in hands made thick with callus and time. His beard, silvered by soot and years, twitched as he read. His lips were a thin, unmoving line. He read the story once, then again, a third time. Not a single word rang true. He had known Cass since she was a child. Bold, stubborn, and too sharp to die stupid. And he knew Weston Hale. The man didn't ride out before first light, unless death or duty was waiting beyond the ridge. 2 nights ago, Noah had seen Hale's black mare limp back into town alone. The animal's side was caked with dried blood. A long tear marred the saddle's flank. And tied around the reins, not flapping loose, but knotted tight, was a strip of dress fabric, pale blue turned gray with ash. It wasn't torn in desperation. It had been tied with care, with intent, a marker, maybe, or a message. Noah had seen war. He knew the difference between panic and planning. He'd stood over craters after mine collapses. He could read the story told in dirt and blood and thread. So he didn't go to the sheriff. Didn't tell the barkeep or gossip in the churchyard. He simply folded the cloth and placed it beneath his workbench, beside his iron and fire, and waited. 2 mornings later, a boy came barreling into his shop, barefoot, face streaked with dust, no more than 10 years old. "Mr. Calder," the boy huffed, breath catching in his chest. You fix horseshoes for Weston Hale? Sometimes, Noah answered, laying down his hammer, every motion measured. The boy dug into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled bundle. He dropped this. Noah took it with slow hands. Blood, dried and dark, stained one edge. Coal dust smeared the corners. But what froze him were the stitched initials in the corner. C.H. Cass Hartley. He stared at the cloth, the weight of it heavier than iron. A pulse thudded hard against his chest as he looked up, past the forge's open doors, to where the mayor's office sat under fluttering campaign banners. Everett Trumbull's grin looked down from freshly printed posters. A safer gray smoke, a cleaner future. Noah's jaw tightened. He folded the cloth carefully, laid it beside the first, and pressed his hand flat over both, as if swearing a silent oath. He said nothing, but when he stoked his forge that afternoon, the fire rose higher, brighter, hungrier. Beneath a leaden sky, snow whispered across the ridge in fine sheets, painting the hills of Montana in white silence. Cass and Weston moved carefully along a narrow trail that cut between drifts and pine, their boots sinking into frost-crusted earth. The forest around them held its breath. Behind them, the first crack rang out, a rifle, distant but sharp. Weston spun, eyes scanning the tree line. "Keep low," he said, voice a hush. Cass's breath clouded in the cold air. "They found us." No need to answer. The second shot confirmed it, closer now, echoing off stone and snow. They broke into a run. Branches clawed at Cass's coat. Weston kept ahead, his wide shoulders carving a path through the underbrush. She stumbled once, nearly fell, but he caught her wrist without breaking stride. Behind them came shouts, the metallic clink of stirrups, the crash of men not bothering to be quiet anymore. These weren't trackers. These were executioners. Weston led her down a shallow ravine, then veered suddenly toward a thicket of dense pine. "Here." He knelt and struck a match. Cass blinked. "What are you?" With a handful of dry needles and sap, he lit the base of a low tree. Smoke rose fast, thick and bitter, curling into the windless morning. "A screen," he said, pulling a small coil of rope from his pack. As the smoke deepened, Weston led her to a cliffside where an old thresher ladder leaned half-buried in snow and rock. It looked brittle, forgotten, a relic no one would notice. "We climb," he said simply. Cass's face went pale. I can't." "You can." The smoke was spreading now, cloaking the lower hill in gray. "I'm scared." He met her eyes. "So was I. Every day. Still am." Then softly he added, "I'm not leaving." She swallowed hard and nodded. He boosted her first, steadying the base of the ladder as she began to climb. Her boots slipped once on the frozen rungs. She bit back a cry, legs trembling. From the smoke below came the muffled command, "Fan out, they're here." Cass froze. "Don't stop," Weston urged. "Go." She climbed higher, dragging her injured leg behind her. Then came the shot. A thunderclap in the mist. Cass turned in horror. Weston jerked backward, a red bloom spreading across his shoulder. He staggered, then grabbed the ladder with his good arm and shoved it upward, anchoring it against the rock as she reached the top. Weston. Another shot missed him by inches. He grabbed the rope tied around the last rung and began to pull himself up, one-handed. His breath hissed through gritted teeth, blood trailing down his arm, melting crimson into the snow. Cass dropped to her knees at the top and reached down. "Give me your hand." He said nothing, only kept climbing, slow and sure. Just as his boot cleared the edge, the ground beneath them shifted. Weston rolled sideways, dragging Cass down with him, both tumbling behind a ridge just as more bullets tore through the smoke. They lay there, hearts pounding, snow in their hair, breath heavy and raw. Cass looked over, eyes wide with shock. His shirt was soaked, but he was alive. Bleeding, yes, but alive. "I thought," she began. "I said, I'm not leaving," he murmured, eyes half-lidded. Below them, the smoke covered their trail like a gray shroud. The voices faded, the hoofbeats turned elsewhere. Cass reached for his hand, squeezing it hard. "You're insane," she whispered. He gave her a crooked smile, blood on his teeth. "But you're mine," she added. The only answer was his head resting back in the snow, eyes watching the clouds drift past, like he trusted the mountain, the sky, and her to carry him now. The cabin sat quiet beneath a ridge of tall firs, half buried in snow, forgotten by time and untouched by men for years. Its walls leaned from age, and the roof had lost more shingles than it kept, but it still stood, barely. Weston had said nothing when they reached it, just limped across the threshold and let the memories take him. Inside, the air smelled of old ash, pine, and dust. A fireplace gaped black in the corner, and a single cot, long unused, sagged against one wall. Cass helped Weston lie down, his body sagging under the pain he'd been carrying in silence. She built a small fire with dry wood from a hidden cache, then turned to tend his wound. He sat shirtless, the firelight dancing across his scarred back and bloodied shoulder. She knelt beside him with a bowl of melted snow, dipping cloth into the warmth and pressing it gently to the wound. He didn't flinch. "You were burning," she whispered. "You didn't make a sound." "I've burned before," he said quietly. Cass paused, waited. He didn't look at her as he spoke, his eyes fixed on the fire. "My father was the manager of Black Hollow Mine 15 years ago. He knew the equipment was failing, knew they wouldn't fix it. They told him to keep quiet, so he did. The day the shaft collapsed, my little brother was down there, just started working." He exhaled sharply through his nose. "They lied, paid off the family, told me and my ma it was an accident. But my father, he couldn't hold it, came out here one night, sat right in that chair." He pointed at a broken rocker in the corner. He poured lamp oil over himself and lit a match. Cass covered her mouth. "I came home to smoke," he said. "Not fire, just smoke." Silence followed, thick and reverent. Cass set the cloth down. Her fingers hovered, unsure, then settled gently on his back. "I carry fire too," she said, "in my bones, since they took my father, since they tried to bury the truth with me." Weston turned to her then, his gaze steady, quiet. "You and me," he said, "we're the ones left to remember." She didn't answer, but she leaned in, resting her forehead to his. The fire cracked behind them. Snow tapped softly at the glassless window. Later, they lay together on the old cot, her arm draped over his chest, his hand resting atop hers. No words passed between them, no promises made, only breath, warmth, and the silent knowing that neither was alone anymore. Before sleep took them, Weston rose once more. He walked to the wall beside the hearth, where rough carvings marked names and dates, his father's, his mother's, and one etched deep with grief, Eli Hale, his brother. He took his knife. Beneath Eli's name, he carved a new line, "No more dying in fire." Then he sheathed the blade, looked back at the woman asleep in his bed, and let the fire warm his face until dawn. The town hall of gray smoke was packed wall to wall, the air thick with anticipation and cigar smoke. Lanterns swung from the rafters, casting flickers across stern faces and folded arms. The benches groaned under the weight of farmers, blacksmiths, housewives, and ranchers. Everyone had come for the final debate, a public forum before the election that promised either hope or more of the same. At the center stood Everett Trumbull, polished and confident behind the podium, his smile wide and gleaming like a preacher in Sunday whites. His voice carried smooth and strong. "Progress," he declared, "comes from discipline, from vision, from safety. That is what I offer this town." A wave of murmurs swept the crowd. Men nodded, arms crossed. Women exchanged glances, whispering in fans and lace gloves. Sheriff Brody sat near the front, his jaw set, unreadable. Then the doors slammed open like thunder. Heads turned, murmurs stopped. A woman near the aisle dropped her handkerchief. Cass Hartley stepped into the light. She wasn't a ghost, but she looked like someone who had outrun death. Her coat was stained with ash, her limp noticeable. She clutched a bundle of papers to her chest as if they were her shield. Her eyes, clear and sharp, scanned the room, fixing on faces that had printed her death and moved on. She walked the aisle, boots echoing on the floorboards. "I have something to say," she said, voice steady. Trumbull blinked, mask slipping. "Miss Hartley, I'm not dead," she cut him off. "Though you tried." Gasps broke the silence, like kindling to a flame. Sheriff Brody rose partway from his seat, unsure. Cass reached the front and laid the papers on the judge's bench. "This is a copy of the ledger I took from the mayor's office," she said. "It details payouts made to families of the Black Hollow victims, payments meant to keep them quiet." She lifted another sheet. "This is testimony from a miner who lived. He was ordered to lock the gate and walk away. Names, dates, all of it, right here." The hall began to shift, boots scraping, hands clenched, whispers blooming like weeds. Trumbull's face drained of color. "Lies. She's unstable. She spent a week in the woods. She spent a week running from your men," came a voice from the back. Every head turned. Weston Hale stepped into the aisle. No hat, his bandaged shoulder visible through his unbuttoned coat. He moved with calm certainty, each footstep tapping against the floor like a hammer to anvil. He joined Cass at the front, standing not behind her, but beside her. He looked out at the crowd, the same crowd that had stared at him for years as if he were a myth, a warning. "I was there," he said quietly. "I saw them push her. I brought her out." Near the front, someone whispered, stunned, "He talks." Weston's eyes didn't waver. "My father died trying to speak truth. My brother died because men like Trumbull covered it. I've lived in silence ever since, but no more." He swept the crowd with his gaze, slow and level. "I was born of fire, but I won't let it take another soul." The room froze. Lanterns seemed to pause their sway. No one breathed. Then a hand rose. Noah Calder, grimy apron, soot-dark fingers. "I saw the blood," he said. "I kept quiet. I shouldn't have." One by one, others stood. A laundress, a rancher, a store clerk. One by one, voices that had stayed quiet found the courage to rise. Trumbull stammered, "This is mob rule." "No," Sheriff Brody said, rising with his badge in hand. "This is justice." Cass turned to Weston. He didn't look at her, but his hand reached, fingers brushing hers. And in that simple touch, the crowd saw not a spectacle, but something far greater. Truth, unshakable, alive. For the first time in Graysmoke, silence lost its grip, and truth stood taller. Spring painted Graysmoke in colors the town hadn't seen in years. The hills rolled soft and green, the river ran full, and at the edge of the Black Hollow pit, once a scar of coal and silence, wild daisies bloomed in waves. The same earth that once smoldered with forgotten names now breathed with new life, as if the ground itself had exhaled the weight of its guilt. Cass sat on the porch of the small cabin they'd built beside the rim. The pit, now fenced and honored with a carved wooden sign bearing the names of the lost, lay quiet behind her. Bees moved among the flowers. Wind curled through the grass, like breath over skin. There was peace here now, not loud or sudden, but slow, deep-rooted, the kind that comes only after fire. Inside, the desk creaked as she pressed her pen to the final page of her story. "I was thrown into a hole meant to bury truth, left to burn, to vanish, to be forgotten. But someone came down after me, not because he had to, not for justice or glory. He came because stillness, to him, was worse than fire. Some men speak loudly. Weston Hale lived quietly, and he saved me, not just from the flames, but from forgetting that love can be found in the most broken ground." She paused, letting the ink dry, then signed it simply, "Cass Hartley, Graysmoke, Montana." She closed the journal, tracing the leather binding with her fingers. That chapter, the darkest of her life, was closed now. But the story it told, of silence breaking, of courage without spectacle, would live on in print, in memory, and in every bloom that now grew from scorched earth. The screen door opened behind her with a creak that had become comfort. Weston stepped out, sleeves rolled, his shoulders still stiff in spring's damp air. He led their mare by the reins, humming low, a tune she didn't know but had started to love. He wore the same boots, the same scuffed belt, but his steps were easier now, not light, not quite, just unburdened. Cass watched him move, the way the morning light kissed his jawline, how he paused to let the horse nuzzle his palm. There was something sacred in the quiet between his breaths, something that made her heart ache in the softest way. He turned toward her, saw her watching, and smiled, just barely. It was enough to undo her all over again. Tears welled in her eyes, not from pain, not from memory, from something quieter, stronger, from the knowing that here, at the edge of all they'd endured, flowers had bloomed where ash once ruled, that they'd built something not in spite of fire, but because of it. He tipped his hat, that same worn thing he'd worn the night he dove into fire. His voice was low, familiar, steady. "Coming?" Cass stood slowly, folded the page, and tucked it inside her journal. Then she stepped off the porch and into the morning, barefoot among the daisies, each step a promise, not of what had passed, but of all that still lay ahead. If this story stirred something in your heart, if Weston's quiet courage or Cass's unbreakable fire stayed with you, don't let it end here. There are more love stories buried beneath the dust of the Wild West, more hearts that risked everything where law ran thin and loyalty ran deep. Hit that hype button if you believe love can climb out of any pit, and don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where every tale rides on grit, grace, and the kind of love that never stays silent. We'll see you on the next trail.